After all the talk, all the back and forth discussions and heated arguments, here we are. The first wave of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate's DLC has come to a close. While we're far from done, thanks to another set of 6 coming over the next year and 3/4, until the first reveal of Pass 2, which might be a while, at least according to Sakurai, we're at a rest area of sorts. A chance to catch our breath, to detox a little after how unhealthy things got at times over the past year, and to look back at how DLC has gone so far. So, how about we do just that? These are my thoughts on the 5+1 DLC fighters that have joined Ultimate's roster so far. This will be a combination of analysis, competitive impressions, and some personal opinions. It'll get subjective, basically, so if your own thoughts differ from mine, that's fairly normal with how much I go against the grain. But without further ado, let's begin. And begin we will at the very start of DLC with a character who snuck in before the first season technically began. One of the least expected newcomers in Smash history, Piranha Plant got out ahead of the pack as a free bonus for those who bought Ultimate early, with the option for late arrivers to purchase afterward. While the circumstances surrounding it are murky at best, some have speculated that it might have been meant for the base game but didn't make it for some reason. I personally think it was started before the rest of DLC to test run the process like Mewtwo last time. It's here and it's very weird. A highly unconventional heavyweight whose tools are front-loaded toward advantage state traps and anti-airs, Piranha Plant can absolutely steamroll opponents when its setups are working. But with hardly any neutral to speak of that isn't unsafe or high commitment, and a few moves that don't quite work as intended, that means you up air losing its hitbox halfway through the animation. It's led to Plant being the weakest of the DLC so far from a competitive standpoint. Though with at least a couple more years worth of balance patches and metagame development yet to come, that could turn around at any time. And it's not like it hasn't had some noteworthy wins already. It's Ultimate, pretty much everyone's done something notable. Despite not being on my wanted list, I kinda developed a soft spot for this one. I was put off by the initial reveal, but Plant really grew on me once I got a closer look at the moveset and its sheer creativity and all the little references worked in. So, respect for the decision. But now we're on to the Fighters Pass proper. With a headliner that shocked the gaming world, rose the hype to unprecedented levels, and might or might not have led to some unsustainably high expectations for the rest of DLC as a side effect. Despite being fairly new, especially by guest fighter standards, Joker managed to sneak his way in as the first addition to the first full season of DLC, despite Persona 5 not even being on a Nintendo system, which will hopefully change eventually. Boasting a very dualistic moveset, Joker's game plan revolves around playing around his rebellion gauge and capitalizing when his persona activates, which lends to a very dynamic fighting style. On his own, he uses evasiveness and mix-ups to open up opportunities to string hits together to offset his lackluster damage output, but when Arsene wakes up and powers up his attacks, Joker's opponents are the ones who have to play carefully instead. A very effective combination that is also challenging to get the hang of, which has made him fairly uncommon competitively despite how strong he is. Trust me, I should know. I tried him out as a possible secondary when his update dropped, but I couldn't win consistently for the life of me. Interestingly enough, despite all the sarcastic jokes about Smash DLC being pay to win, Joker is Ultimate's only DLC character so far to actually be considered top tier. And unlike the examples last game that set the stereotype, he hasn't been over-centralizing at all. Instead of forcing the metagame to revolve around him, he's just one more member of the in-crowd, so to speak. Goes to show how Sakurai and the DLC team are being much more careful this time around. I had a very up and down reaction to this one. When rumors first circulated claiming Erdrick from Dragon Quest III was getting in, I was pretty lukewarm about the idea. Wasn't against it, but I had no real experience with the series. But the eventual reveal trailer really caught my attention. 4 different playable heroes, a heavier emphasis on magic than I'd expected, with a long list of spells at their fingertips. And at first glance, it looked like Hero was going to have multiple spells available per special that you'd be able to menu between mid-match, encouraging players to customize their loadout on the fly and pick the right tools for the matchup or situation, just like in an RPG. I was legitimately excited for the idea. But then what we got was something else. Instead of a fighter with incredible versatility kept in check by his mana supply, we got someone reliant on RNG. Randomly available spells, random critical hits, and otherwise clunky movement and attacks that force at least some reliance on both. And I was left really disappointed. I have a pocket hero I pull out sometimes to mess around with every now and then, but not enough to play seriously. That said, I wonder how people who are into Dragon Quest feel about the concept. Are you guys satisfied with how Smash interpreted these protagonists? Oh, and shout out to all the people who freaked out after the gameplay demo and thought Hero Mage were going to destroy the meta and coast their way to easy wins through sheer luck before we had any proof that it could realistically happen. Have we learned our lesson not to jump to conclusions and let things play out first, guys? And now, the duo whose rare return shocked the gaming world all over again. Or the western side of it, at least. Though Nintendo and Microsoft being increasingly buddy-buddy lately made it decently possible, fans of Banjo and Kazooie went ballistic the moment that Jiggy bounced across the screen. For me, though, this was yet another character reveal that I was just neutral toward. Was happy for their fans, don't get me wrong, but it just left me hoping for a couple other old friends who've been missing in action to return as well. Or anyone on my wanted list. But anyway, with an oddball of a moveset, the Bear and Bird feel very true to form thanks to a lot of their animations and attacks being either direct lifts or adaptations of moves they actually learn in their games. Shout out to even having their movement be reliant on Kazooie, with multiple mid-air jumps and a super fast run once she gets going, but one of the slowest initial dashes and poor airspeed when Banjo has to move on his own. Gotta love little details like that. From claw swipes to beak jabs, wing whacks, egg shots, a dive bomb, and the Wonder Wing and its infamous invincibility all make for a very distinct and unique fighter, and one whose optimal playstyle isn't very popular. Turns out their game plan kinda wants them to wall people out with eggs in neutral while fishing for grenade egg confirms or cheesing people with surprise Wonder Wing charges, and it's turned a lot of competitive players off from maining them, even though they're generally considered at least mid-tier. But how do casual players feel about them? I don't run into that side of the community very often, so maybe their impressions of this pair are more positive and I'm just overthinking things like usual. Full disclosure, I can't play command input characters for the life of me, so the gameplay on this one's gonna be rough. I know, insert stereotype about Smash players here. As a character who wasn't brought up much before his reveal, Terry met some backlash at first for not being one of a select handful of characters that speculators expected to see get in. Though with his home series being such a major part of Sakurai's fighting game experience, and an indirect inspiration for what eventually led to Smash Bros., he's not too surprising a choice in hindsight. I swear I mean that as neutrally as possible. The whole Sakurai bias talk is overblown and gets used too often to dismiss less bandwagon characters. Going into his update, I was worried that Terry wouldn't feel different enough from Ryu and Ken to really stand out. And I still don't know how I feel about his implementation, honestly. Just like the Shotos, he's a glass cannon of sorts who struggles to approach and then blows people up with high damage combos and cancels once he does get in. I don't know, could there have been ways to put more emphasis on what makes him different? Then again, I have no direct experience with Terry's games, so maybe it's just unfamiliarity on my part. That said, to their credit, he does feel like a different-ish take on the whole lifted straight from a fighting game concept. He ditches the light and heavy tilts in favor of a back special, super specials, and a different style of command inputs that are actually a pretty ingenious homage to Fatal Fury's distinct control scheme. While Street Fighter's 3-button setup is reflected in Ryu's and Ken's specials, Terry's specials reference the 4-button controls of SNK's fighting games. Gotta love little details like that. And now, the last note surprise, the curveball who caught almost everyone off guard and was met with mass rage simply for not being someone else. And yet, Byleth was the first DLC character I was legitimately hyped for. I guess I'm just weird like that. Though past reveal cycles have usually ended on quieter notes, less about making headlines and more about supplementing the big reveals that have already happened with characters who are lower key but do something different or interesting. And their Weapon Master angle means Byleth is very unique in a way that also addressed the sword fighter complaints. Wielding 4 different heroes' relics really surprised me. It's very different from the character concept I made back in the fall, which goes to show how this character had multiple ways to interpret their abilities. Anyone in 3 houses can learn to wield multiple weapon types with the right training, so while Byleth can't normally wield 3 of the relics, it feels like the kind of acceptable creative liberty we've seen with some other movesets. A quote-quote distance demon, Byleth is all about using disjointed attacks to keep opponents out at mid-range while also boasting some dangerously strong mix-ups, but without much mobility to speak of. Guess the relics are so heavy that it's affecting their attack speed? The slow movement combined with attacks that can't be just thrown out on a whim makes for a playstyle that is much less straightforward than it seems, which led to a lot of competitive players deeming Byleth weak and unviable at first. But in the months since, we've actually seen a few players put up some notable results despite the character's drawbacks. Ultimately, I think it's gonna be a while before we have a clear picture of this professor's true potential. And that's where we currently stand. An interesting batch of 5+1 DLC fighters who cover a pretty wide range of fighting styles and personal tastes. If you'd stuck me in a room before DLC started and demanded I come up with a list of 5 or 6, it'd have been different for sure, and I imagine it'd have been the same for any of you as well. But that's part of the beauty of it, I guess. You never quite know what to expect. Though for me, there was actually a lot more to it than that. You see, despite everything Ultimate had accomplished, up until recently I'd felt left out. I know it sounds hard to believe after the monumental task of bringing every veteran back, and after how many big-name characters and long-running fan requests finally made it in, but somehow, not a single one of the characters I'd been hoping for got into the base game. And up through the new year, DLC had been going the same way. And that's despite adding several more to the list that I'd become interested in. Maybe it was just my personal taste being weird. I've always been more into Nintendo itself than third parties, more open to newer faces than the fandom tends to be, and more invested in characters with unique ideas or a lot of moveset potential, not just because they're popular to support or because they could represent something. But between all my wanted lists continuing to miss out, and DLC from the start of the Fighters Pass onward seeming, at the time, to be focusing on star power above all else, it was starting to look like I was gonna get left out in the cold and only be able to watch everyone else celebrate. It felt like I didn't belong. Which had the side effect of reopening some old wounds. Growing up, I got left out of stuff. A lot. People only really hung out with me when it was convenient for them or when associating with me wasn't a social liability. Not only that, when I tried to compete in pretty much anything, I was hardly ever taken seriously. No matter what unique or standout skills I had to offer, most of the time I was treated like I was just getting in the way of someone else's rightful glory, someone more popular or more expected to be there. And then, after watching almost everyone get at least one newcomer they were hoping for except for me, and then with the character choices the first Fighters Pass was making, it was starting to hit uncomfortably close to home. Smash has always been this place where gaming gods, rising stars, and minor leaguers, and their fans, can all meet and duke it out on equal terms. But the further things went into the pass, the more it was starting to seem like you needed to have a narrow set of criteria to stand a chance now. And entire parts of the fan base, including fans of any Nintendo character in what is still at its core a Nintendo fighting game, were going to be left out. And that's why, despite the controversy, I think the very end of the pass carries more meaning than it seems. It meant a lot to me because now, finally, a character I was hoping for made it in. Now I didn't feel excluded anymore. And I think it also means something positive even for people who weren't fans of the choice of character, because a lot of barriers that were assumed to be present from the start of the pass onward have been broken. Now we have proof that you don't have to be a big-name third party, don't have to introduce a new franchise, and don't have to make the collective internet explode in hype to still have a chance, which opens the door again for a lot of other characters. And while there are still a few more barriers that might or might not be in place, we still don't know if spirits can become playable, for one. I think this was a meaningful step toward, hopefully, more fans not having to feel left out themselves before all is said and done. Yeah, I know it sounds sappy and I'm reading way too far into things, but I think all these emotions stirred up by this stupid fandom are valid, you know? It's like a little window into human nature, for better or worse, that we can observe and use to try and grow as people. I know, wishful thinking, right? Deep introspective stuff aside, hopefully the second Fighters Pass offers another set of interesting newcomers from a wide variety of places. Sakurai's statement on wanting to emphasize new mechanics and ideas to catch people's interest has me optimistic. Though hopefully we can get a more generally inclusive set this time that's less weighted toward just big-name third parties. There are a lot of fan favorites and compelling yet under-discussed options still available, and it'd be a shame if so many of them ended up left out. And can we please get some DLC stages that are competitively viable? Even the hazardless versions keep having stuff that makes them not work in a tournament setting, and that's another missed opportunity that I hope turns around. So yeah, that's more or less my thoughts on Ultimate's DLC characters so far, and where things stand heading into Season 2. Hard to say whether the next pass will play out similarly to the previous one, or if they'll take things in a different direction. Too early to know yet, so we're best off waiting and seeing how things go, rather than locking in expectations and then busting out the pitchforks if something else happens. But how are you feeling right now about Ultimate after the first wave of DLC? Anyone you're still holding out hope for? Anyone who hasn't been talked about very often? Special thanks for this video goes to these people here. And a shout out to my patrons for their continued support despite all the ups and downs I've gone through. If you're interested in becoming a patron, check out the link down in the description or on the end screen. And so, until next time, who knows what the future holds?